This book is excellent. It's an excellent book about the history of mass communication research in this country, and uh, a proper political frame on it. Certainly better than the frame I got in grad school, and one I hope is being brought into grad school programs. Though I don't suspect that it is. And the long story short is that, as I wrote here in my notes, ultimately what Glander is considering is the fear among the ruling elite of the Luigis of the world. The two world wars, one and two, that is, were as much about solidifying techniques of national propaganda as they were about winning wars for natural resources and colonial territory. So that's sort of the theme of my approach for my classes, and what I would share with you all here is that what I think this chapter does, and the book more broadly does, is to, maybe it's an introduction, but it's an extension of, if maybe, or for some of us, an introduction to the fears of the ruling elite in the 20th century, who did not take for granted that the form of settler colonial democracy that we see now would take form, who were not convinced at the time that socialists and communists and black liberationists were defeated. They did not take any of that for granted, as seems to be the case in many ways now. At least they thought it necessary to organize how the ruling elite would continue to sustain themselves, with an understanding that they were having to manipulate an increasing both number and diverse population of so-called citizens. So World War One, before World War One, Glander argues that propaganda was evolved largely to promote the First World War, to promote, to encourage young white men in particular to go fight in Europe. And then after World War One, and then with enhanced evolution after World War Two, the goal became maintaining a social order. And they're explicit in discussing that if propaganda can be used for war, it can certainly be used for peace. And there was a vigorous discussion in this country, sometimes debate over how to define propaganda. Was it good? Was it bad? To what extent, as Glander talks a lot about in this book, um, it's a critical look at the foundation of for the field of mass communication and its interaction more broadly with society's institution of education. That is, as Glander even asks at one point in this chapter, will those in power were asking, will education be used to propagandize people, or will it be used to teach Americans how to think critically to resist propaganda? And the former is the version that won out. That is, that education would be part of a process that propagandizes and manipulates the public opinion of most of the people in this country. All right, so that's just a quick summary or an overview of what he's saying here, and I'll just share a little bit more uh, as here in it's a little bit more of the chapter, just to. So as it says here in the pink, for instance, we take for granted a highly centralized and powerful national government, a ubiquitous celebrity-rife electronic media, and an equally ubiquitous consumer culture. We take for granted the view of selfhood, the psychological characteristics and the values that follow from these circumstances. Nevertheless, to the people of the early part of this century, that is the 20th, people who witnessed the enormous societal, social, and cultural changes that conditioned the emergence of mass society, these things were by no means certain, and from many perspectives, they were by no means desirable. All right, so that's just what his way of saying what I was just saying a moment ago. They did not take for granted that any of this kind of society that we live in today was going to evolve, and those who didn't agree with it needed to be dealt with in one way or another. The focus here is largely through propaganda. Prior to the outbreak of World War One, the term propaganda possessed neither pejorative connotations nor apparently the kind of inherent interest that would prompt scholars to take it up as an important object of study. That would change. And this figure, Harold Laswell, who in my classes we'll talk a little bit more about as a sort of exemplar of what was happening here. He became a major figure who, coming, of course, out of the University of Chicago, and who would eventually side with the idea that propaganda was necessary for a country that claimed to be a democracy. So like when Chomsky popularized the phrase propaganda is to democracy what violence is to totalitarianism. In other words, a society that has more of a claim to freedom and democracy needs more propaganda. This is where he was getting it from. The foundations of that approach, or that frame of reference, begin with these folks like Harold Laswell, uh, um, uh, what's his name? We'll come back to it in a second. But what was his name? Laswell's. I've just been reading this, so he's a lot of the focus here. But there's another guy we'll come back to in a minute. And it's just uh, Merton was another one at one point that he worked with. But this, we'll come back to this. But um, the the point being that it became clear just that this idea that uh, Americans had evolved an individualist ethic and were being promoted or encouraged, or some to mythologies around independence, free will, individual sovereignty, the rugged individual, the American exceptionalist ethic, all of that required that the individual be maintained within a certain propagandized logic. You can't go too far. That freedom and that free will had to be managed. Uh, so this goes over some of the history, as I've talked about before on this platform. George Creel, the pre World War One evolution of propagandizing people to prepare them for war. But let's see, the part I wanted to. This is so. And I know lately I've been talking a lot about selling free enterprise, the big myth, and these books that have been talking about the post World War II shift of the ruling elite to propagandize society back into an understanding that big government is bad and private enterprise is good, and the free market and free market fundamentalism was the ideal. Here, Glander's talking a little bit about it differently and starting a little bit earlier with this idea that many people came to believe that the war, meaning World War One, had been waged primarily for the benefit of rich industrialists and bankers who had profited greatly from it. The notion received its most complete articulation in Engelbrecht and Hanglin's 1934 book, Merchants of Death, in which they argued the U.S. involvement in the war was precipitated to serve the interests of bankers and munitions makers, including the DuPont Company and J.P. Morgan. So a lot of what ends up happening as a response to that is, again, kind of what Farnsworth and the authors of the Big Myth were talking about in their work, that Glander points out here, that essentially a field of mass communication had to be evolved so that the social sciences could be applied to the study of communication for the purposes of manipulating people and shaping their public opinion in service of and in defense of a ruling elite and their corporate interests. So Glander helps us by talking. He gives us an overview of a lot of the different arguments being made prominently in the early 20th century, talking about, is propaganda good? How should it be used? How should it be defined? Um, and ultimately, so which I think, number primarily this is important, certainly for my classes, in just really encouraging people to understand and recognize how much time and energy has been spent even before the field was evolved and organized into studying it, what propaganda is and how it should be used and defined, and ultimately the point being with a goal of manipulating a majority of the people in a society who are not going to benefit from all the wealth produced, all the goods and services produced, who are going to need to be again manipulated uh, in service of the class and racial interests of a ruling elite. Harold Laswell discriminated propaganda from other forms of social control, stipulating that propaganda is concerned exclusively with the manipulation of symbols. Propaganda refers solely to the control of public opinion by significant symbols, or to speak more concretely and less accurately, by stories, rumors, reports, pictures, and other forms of social communication, he wrote in 1927. Propaganda is concerned with the management of opinions and attitudes by the direct manipulation of social suggestion rather than by altering other conditions in the environment or in the organism. And I think actually I should have highlighted, I mean, that's, well, I'm pointing myself to read it, but this is exactly, this is really what I keep saying all the time in my own way. This is a lot of where I'm getting it. Like, they're not going to change the conditions. We're not redistributing wealth. We're not ending the colonization. We're not ending the racism. We're not ending the patriarchy. We're not ending the exploitation. We're not doing none of that. What we will do is manipulate and manage the public opinions through a manipulation of symbols, suggestion, rumors, but rather than anything other than altering the conditions in the environment or in the organism. With the idea, of course, that your attitudes preclude your actions. And it's interesting when, and sort of foreshadowing, not specifically this point, but the discussion later with about Professor Dave and the science communication, is that science apparently has demonstrated that the choices we make, the decisions we make, the actions we take have already been predetermined biologically, chemically, before we act, before we say something or think to say something or move to do something. Our our biological processes have already triggered that domino effect that we are sort of the last ones to consciously be aware of in the performance of that action. So if there's a parallel here, it is that the actions we consciously engage are themselves the result of often unknown, unconsciously delivered manipulations of attitudes, suggestions, public opinion, etc. It's the inception effect of sorts. Glandra talks more again about the function of news and education to be essentially components of manipulation and propaganda. Um, the use of advertising. And here's where he's talking about this issue of the individual. Technology and an antiquated notion of individualism had been put in the service of these pecuniary interests, resulting in a social order that was attuned to meeting genuine human needs. The older notion of the rugged pioneering individual was now grafted onto the ideology of corporate capitalism, the activities of which, mass production and mass consumption, essentially contradicted the full development of the individual. The individual is now submerged or lost to techniques promoting an external conformity, despite the fact that most Americans continue to express faith in the creed of individualism, and despite the fact that development of scientific technique, the fact that the development of scientific technique had the potential to serve an emancipatory role. The problem of constructing a new individuality consonant with the objective conditions under which we live is the deepest problem of our times, Dewey wrote. In other words, as I interpret it, we want to promote this place as being about rugged individualism, but that's to manipulate you so you don't see the collectivist, the imposed collectivist ideals, that is collectivist in this sense that you will be collectively exploited and be happy about it and be praising the individual capitalists who do it, which is why to this day we see people telling us you should praise those billionaires that you see. They've invented themselves and their own wealth. They're self constructs of brilliance and genius and leadership. When in reality, as he talk about here, whether it's Walter Lippmann, whether it's Edward Bernays, whether it's Harold Laswell, or this character Biddle, William Biddle, a Case Western Reserve University professor. The real issue is that the rugged individualism of the American is itself a mirage meant to hide the fact that those who rule are an invisible government. A society continues to exist by allowing skillful and wealthy minorities to regiment and manipulate the majority by a sort of invisible government, wrote Biddle. Is obviously not the ideal society from the viewpoint of such a democracy. A majority manipulated into increasing gullibility is not living to the full. So, whether you are fully in agreement with it or a critic of it, the recognition that people's attitudes are manipulated by the invisible government. Bernays wrote of the invisible government in his 1920 book Propaganda as a beautiful thing. Lippmann came back in 1922 with Public Opinion and basically said the same thing. We need an invisible government to manipulate the public opinion of the masses, with them thinking that they are individual and rugged. They're already talking about the consolidation of newspapers and media outlets in the 1930s, that is Biddle and others, and recognizing the ease with which a ruling elite could manipulate. I made a note here about the internet, which would just make all of this much easier eventually. Shout out to my man Chris Simpson, who's referenced here. They developed in 1937 at Columbia University the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. Propaganda is the expression of opinion or action by individuals or groups deliberately designed to influence opinions or actions of other individuals or groups with reference to predetermined ends. Again, in talking about the struggle between promoting individualism, promoting free will and democracy and the like, it runs into a problem that Laswell and others sought to address. The bonds of personal loyalty and affection which bound a man to his chief have long since dissolved. Monarchy and class privilege have gone the way of of all flesh, and the idolatry of the individual passes for the official religion of democracy. It is an atomized world in which individual whims have wider play than ever before and requires more strenuous exertions to coordinate and unify than formerly. The new antidote to willfulness is propaganda. If the mass will be free of chains of iron, it must accept its chains of silver. If it will not love, honor, and obey, it must not expect to escape seduction. It's slickly written. Oh, but you all want to be individuals in your little democracy? Word, I got something for you. And it's propaganda. And if you think you're going to be free from your chains of iron, you're going to get chains of silver and you're going to love it. And we're going to make you want it and love it and be happy to wrap yourselves in chains of silver. Because you could talk about you not going to love and obey your master, but you will be seduced. You will be seduced. Laswell's 1927 text was representative of those works in which it was difficult to determine whether the author was pursuing a study of propaganda techniques in order to decipher it or in order to learn how to use it effectively. And that's exactly, I love that he wrote that, Glander, because when I was in grad school and first reading Laswell, I kept thinking the same thing, Laswell and others. Are you being critical of this? Because I'm reading it and saying, like, yo, you're exposing the problem. But my professors and some of my classmates were all saying, no, he's being critical of it. I'm like, I don't know. later here, Glander comes out and clarifies for us that Laswell was and Walter Lippmann and others that were presented sometimes in grad school as being kind of, hey, we just being here. No. They wanted this. They wanted an organized manipulation by, as Bernays says here, again, this invisible government. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. And then look here how Foster Dulles loved oh, he hated. So that's the point. That's the point. So Foster Dulles says Laswell's study was Machiavellian and should be destroyed. Now, John and Foster Dulles, these are the diabolical brothers who helped construct the intelligence community, the very WASP-driven intelligence community, who have been behind and destabilized almost every socialist and democratic government that they experienced. And whatever they came across one, they destroyed it. And that's why I'm saying Dulles, even though Laswell is actually on Dulles's team, Dulles is saying, get rid of this book. He's snitching. He's telling on us. Because when I'm reading Laswell, I'm saying he's telling on you. Oh man! So they talk a little bit more about how propaganda had to be reduced to euphemism and public relations and mass communication and public opinion. The development of a rational technique of social control as are today being contemplated will require the most effective utilization of the newspaper and all other instruments of public opinion. They were clear. Caitlin, that's the dude I was trying to remember earlier. Caitlin, of course, was not the first person to argue for the development of a public political science that would concentrate on the construction of effective propaganda techniques in the interest of controlling public opinion. 14 years earlier, Walter Lippmann, who did not share Caitlin's compunction for precluding the democratic state from engaging in propaganda, had argued vigorously for a political science that would master the techniques by which the opinions of mass society could be regulated. Again, the ruling elite, these elite white men, were very clear. The impact there were very clear of their ability to manipulate the public opinion of the masses. There was some disagreement as whether the government should do it, whether other forms should take hold, what was but all of them understood that it could be done, was being done, and then it was just it just depended on in what form and to what levels of severity each one of them thought it was necessary to engage. But essentially, Walter Lippmann, who became one of the dominant thinkers of the time, as is written here he says here, Lippmann proposed remedy, said that there should be a central agency, an independent expert organization for making the unseen facts intelligible to those who have to make the decisions. As well, this I've quoted in my own dissertation, as well as organizing public opinion for the press. Walter Lippmann, this legendary journalist, was saying that we have to have a central agency that's going to teach those who make the decisions what decisions they need to make, and that will give the press its opinion. So they were saying we need a field of mass communication. We need an organized study and production of opinion manipulating and organizing abilities. And then hence comes the field of mass communications research. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.